Hello, I'm Rohan,
And I'm Nick.
and today we're going to be talking about the influence of magic and religion on overall Islamic societal views of mental illness and how they were treated. And we'll be doing so across different time periods. As just mentioned, I wanted to highlight the agenda and our talking points because we'll be starting at looking at early Islamic society and the viewpoints, the causation, the potential causation at least, and the treatment of mental illness at that point in time. Then we want to transition into more modern times by looking at the early mental asylums and the overall impact they had on different patients. And then we want to transition into the modern Middle Eastern society and specifically look at viewpoints again, treatment again, and then the roles of religion and magic and what they played on different citizens. And lastly, we will share our sources and wrap up the presentation. So to begin, a well-known example and perfect representation of how mental illness looked in early Islamic society would be the story Layla and Majnun. As we know based on the context of our class, Majnun encountered a girl in his town. Layla became insanely smitten with her and fell in love. While the feelings were mutual, a lot of people in society weren't on board with this, and the name Majnun was coined because of his quote-unquote madness. And overall, them seeing each other was prohibited by their parents. Eventually, Majnun was set off into the wilderness, and he literally turned mad and he literally turned ill. And because of that, he cut himself off from the world, eventually dealing with more sadness and more sadness as time went on, with his parents dying and not having Layla's company. It really ended with both of them dying a tragic death. And although the story might not be, every part of it might not be fully applicable, the overall theme about illness and how it was negatively portrayed was really prevalent in early Islamic society. This story really showcases the ideas and perception of madness at the time. Someone who is totally delusional was considered to be a beast, a menace to society, and someone who had to live in complete isolation. So moving on, in early Islamic societies, mental illness and madness was seen as being supernatural in origin, and more specifically, it was believed to be caused by demons, evil spirits, curses, or even from God himself. Those afflicted weren't pitied, but instead judged and outcast as they were seen as deserving if they were to have a mental illness at the time. And people overall felt those with mental illnesses had the problems due to sinful actions, and the illness was more of a result or a consequence rather than just a phenomenon. As a result, many people with mental illnesses at the time suffered immensely and few ever received significant treatment. On top of that, one last thing to consider is that at this time is in Islamic religion, suicide was seen as the ultimate sin, and even considering it was closely related as another extremely taboo topic. This led many to try to hide their illnesses and ultimately suffer in silence. Early treatments for mental illness, moving on to the next topic, centered around different herbs and drinks that were concocted to help alleviate symptoms. And some examples of these symptoms were restlessness, other physical symptoms like dead-looking eyes or dry tongue. These treatments also included being exposed to pleasing scents, baths, massages, and abstaining from different foods and different drinks. On the other hand, other potential treatments could have been religious-based and could have been centered around driving demons, strengthening the relationship of the patient with God. And as you can see, here are a few visuals that describe different herb and different plant-based treatments. After all of this, I'll kick it off to Nick now to talk about early mental asylums and transition us into the modern day.
In terms of the early mental asylums, many of the beginning mental asylums that were found in the Middle East prior to the influence of colonization in like Western medicine, many of them were run by religious caves, and we know from the readings and examples of the readings that some of them were described as like miniature, almost like caves, and these inmates were just cast off to there, some of them in chains, things of that nature. and they were beaten and tortured as a result. And while the Quran was recited and things like that, basically, mental illness, going off of what Rohan has previously discussed, like they felt that these people were deserving of these actions and they were sinful and they were being rebuked for these actions. So they were treated like animals, and they were given improper bedding, horrible drinking water. They were absolutely like beaten with sticks, things of that nature. And very few of them were ever cured or let alone improved, like at all. Very few, if any, official records were kept regarding discharges, records of treatment, deaths, anything like that. And even the early asylums that began to form, that were based off of Western psychology brought on by like colonial influences. Many of them still did not really offer, while they may have treated patients better, more humanely, they really did not do much in terms of overall treatment of patients. As they were more concerned with reinforcing and indoctrinating these patients with Western ideals rather than trying to understand their culture and where they're coming from. So many of them just did not understand the different aspects that they may have faced that were different from men and women in Europe, that may have resulted in them being there in the first place. Moving on to the more modern view of mental illness, most who suffer, mental illness in the Middle East now are seen as people who are just that, mentally ill. Previously had been the case. Many of them were said to, or thought that they were, possessed or something of that nature. Whereas, thanks to colonialism and its influences, Western psychology has more so taken hold as the general consensus, and most are seen as being mentally ill rather than being possessed. And this has brought along the Western psychological principles and like definitions of different mental disorders, like the DSM-5 and things like that. And an important aspect of all of this is like incorporating cultural understanding and religious understandings and teachings while trying to treat these patients, because cultural and religious beliefs in, say, the Middle East are significantly different than those of Europeans in Christianity, and that needs to be taken into account. Mental illness is now more so seen as an illness, just like any other illness, and that means it can be cured, and there is a physical reason for why it's happening. But for the most part, considering how looked down upon suicide and things of that nature are in Islam, it is still very much so a taboo topic, especially in the Middle East, but not nearly as much as it once was. Yeah. In terms of modern treatments, again, most of them center around ideas that are heavily influenced from colonialism, and antidepressants, antipsychotics, modern medicines that they use are used. Therapies are a treatment option, like different kinds of therapies, whether it's cognition based or other things, behavioral based. They're options, but they have proven to not always be effective, especially if these therapists are more trained in the Western ways and ideals and are not really as familiar with the cultural and societal values of Middle Eastern Islamic peoples. So therapies have seen mixed results for the most part, and it really depends on the specific therapist. Other potential treatments are like religious guidances and like teachers who are going to help them with helping them to with Quran, recitation, prayers, and generally trying to strengthen their beliefs and the role of God and Islam in their daily lives, and other things such as meditation and aromatherapy, of course, are also on the table. In terms of the role of religious and healing that is still present, we're going to showcase this with a short clip.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أينما تكونوا يأتي بكم الله جميعا الله على كل شيء قدير أينما تكونوا يأتي بكم الله جميعا الله على كل شيء قدير. Bonjour. Bonjour. Je suis venu en paix. Ah, que si je suis venu en paix. Alors, écoutez-moi attentivement. Appelle tous les autres qui sont
As you can see by the clip, it's still very much prevalent and still takes place in the Middle East. It is not as widespread, and it's not like necessarily the go-to treatment, but much like in Western medicine, there are ideas such as, homeopathy and alternative medicine. This is kind of that type of, fits that type of role in the Middle East, even to this day. And, many of them, people who have tried or, did not find success with, Western medicine, ideals, whether that be because, as I mentioned, therapists do not understand their cultural beliefs and understandings and incorporate them, or, medicines just do not work for them. They end up potentially turning to these. But another problem is there are a lot of like scammer types who prey on these, who understand that, mental illness is very taboo, and a lot of the people who are unable to find immediate success with like Western medicine, they become very desperate and turn to these, religious people that either drive out demons or what have you. And so that is a huge problem. There are a lot of scammers who are looking to take advantage of these people who are extremely desperate. And many of them, as like in the clip we saw, they revolve around like rituals and like Quran resuscitations to like drive out the demons. You can see the lady here was shaking and violently screaming and just seemed to be acting like very abnormally. And that also, fits right in with what I had been saying before. Like many of them are more likely to accept this idea that they are possessed, as it is easier for them to understand than traditionally than to say, oh, I have a mental illness. So a lot of that, there could very well be, and it is believed that there are definitely still some, instances of, possessions and things like that. But many of them, many modern physicians feel that many of them just, they have this belief in their head, and instead of recognizing it as mental illness, it manifests itself as some kind of like false possession. But in these cases, things like we had just seen are very beneficial, and religious teachers who can guide them on making sure to include daily prayers and focusing on Quranic teachings are beneficial to some, and even some who found no results from other methods have begun to find success with it. So this is why it is still prevalent.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, for sharing all of that. And that wraps our presentation up. We just wanted to end by sharing all the sources that we used. Obviously, the corresponding visuals and their links were placed in the slides earlier as we went, but these are the sources we drew from. Some of them came from our own additional research, and some of them were the PDFs or readings that were drawn from throughout the course of class time. And one last thing before we fully wrap this presentation up is one last thank you. Thank you very much for a great semester. Really enjoyed it, and having the combined autonomy of doing things at our own pace and the combined discussion to really reinforce key concepts